Thank you for taking time to watch this video today. I'm Jennifer Carls, co-founder and director of Roots of Inclusion. Roots of Inclusion is a partner organization of the Family Engagement Collaborative. We have developed this training module for the Washington State Inclusionary Practices Professional Development Project. The purpose of this presentation is to provide an overview of the systems mapping component utilized in the Inclusionary Practices Community Conversation Toolkit, and to describe how systems thinking concepts have been incorporated into the toolkit for use by facilitators and planning teams. Understanding systems is a critical piece of ensuring that community conversations are inclusive of diverse perspectives, and that all those impacted by inclusive practices in our schools and communities are involved in creating equitable solutions. Because every system is perfectly aligned to produce its current outcomes, we must work to understand the system in which we are trying to effect change to ensure that change is equitable and inclusive. By the end of this video module, you will gain a basic understanding of taking a systems focus of a change that we are trying to effect, understand how systems mapping works in the IPP Community Conversation Toolkit, and appreciate why systems mapping matters and is an essential component of the Community Conversation Toolkit. Systems thinking is not a new concept. It is a set of habits and practices that is based in the belief that the parts of the system can best be understood in the context of relationships with each other and with other systems, rather than in isolation. Systems mapping allows us to understand how parts of a system are organized to form a whole system. In the context of the IPP Community Conversation Toolkit, it allows us to identify resources and relationships necessary for meaningful inclusion to take root and flourish through understanding intersecting systems and identifying shareholders within our communities. In this video module, Roots of Inclusion partnered with Be Culture and its co-founders, James and Kristen Whitfield. James and Kristen work with organizations and community to design and implement efforts that overcome the status quo's tendency to resist change and do so in ways that unify and engage people. Be Culture uses a framework that is rooted in the system change and equity tenets of adaptive leadership and beloved community. In his work, James employs a multidisciplinary approach resulting from a broad base of experiences. He has served as an executive in business, nonprofit, and government. He has also held positions on numerous local, statewide, and national boards of directors. We intended for this module to have the feeling of an authentic learning environment, so we created a workshop setting where this video was recorded. In this video, we learn about why systems focus is important, how mapping systems helps us to identify who needs to be included to advance change, and we will watch an interactive mapping exercise and see what that looks like in practice. Now, let's learn more from Be Culture.
So one of the things that I get to do today is to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is systems. My adult kids will tell you that almost any question they ask me, any topic they bring up, I go, you know, it really comes down to understanding systems. So we're really going to take a moment and just unpack this concept of systems. And one of the reasons that this is so important is because a lot of the time we're really invested in change efforts, and we don't understand sort of what is at play in order to make that change happen. And having a system-specific approach, understanding the system you're dealing in, understanding what the levers are to make changes within that particular system is, as far as our work is concerned, one of the biggest differences between successful change efforts and efforts that ultimately don't turn out the way that, frankly, we want them to. So it focuses our attention within a particular area where we understand where the authority and influence rests in order to make things move or make things stop. It also moves beyond the typical individualistic framing for making things happen. Like there's this tendency to think that as long as individuals would simply behave better or right, that then the outcomes would be different. And that certainly would be helpful. Like, I agree, it'd be super nice if individuals would behave better. Like, I'm in, I'm all for that. However, it turns out that there's more to systems than simply the individuals within the system. And so understanding the role that something like training and information and individual growth, like what role does that play in system change, as opposed to thinking that that's the only thing that causes system change, is a big piece of why understanding systems is super important. Last but not least, one of the reasons that we do this is so that we understand how to move towards equity. So we can understand the people who are being affected by something who may not have the power or not invited, whose power is being marginalized. They're not being invited into the right spaces to be able to help determine things that are going to affect them. So understanding the system that's at play helps us move towards equity, because then we can see really clearly, oh, these people are being affected by something, but they don't really have, they're not being invited to wherever the decision-making table happens to be in order to determine what might actually be in their best interests. So that's why we're going to focus on systems, which really begs the question, like, what is a system? And so for the purposes of our conversation, we're going to think about social systems specifically. And the way that we're going to define it, again, there's lots of different ways to define a system. The way we're going to define it is they are the practices within a group of people that result in patterns of outcome over time. So they're the practices within a group of people that result in patterns of outcomes over time. Now, those practices can be intentional or unintentional. Those patterns could be intentional or unintentional. Those outcomes can be intentional or unintentional. It isn't always that people within a system recognize what their patterns are and or what those outcomes are. But our understanding of a system helps us see it at a systems level, what those practices are and how those practices are related to and ultimately produce those outcomes. It's also important to know that those patterns, right, have an effect on internal patterns. So those practices have an effect on internal patterns. Those practices also have an effect on whatever the external outputs are. So as we think about something like education and the systems within education, there are patterns that affect what happens within school buildings or within school districts, the internal patterns. And there are patterns that, those patterns also affect whatever the outputs are, who graduates, what does graduation mean for that person, whether or not that person gets to participate within the context of general education setting, right? Like the patterns affect both what's happening internally in the system, and it also affects what's happening, what the outputs are of the system. Now, here's a thing, an axiom of systems that we need to make sure we understand, a maxim, because everything else we say is built upon this. And it is that every system is perfectly aligned to produce its current outcomes. Every system is perfectly aligned to produce its current outcomes. Now, in some ways, that's simply a tautology, right? Like there are outcomes, there is a system, those two things are related. So obviously, the outcomes are related to whatever the system is. And it's also much deeper than that. Like as we begin thinking about what the outcomes are of the systems that we're paying attention to, we have to recognize that that is not dysfunction in our system. That is the system. Now, we can set aside whether or not the people who designed the system originally intended for those outcomes to happen. There's a debate about that on all sorts of things. At the end of the day, though, that doesn't actually matter. What matters is, I mean, it matters, but that's not how we move to system change. We have to acknowledge and recognize, it turns out that these outputs and outcomes that we don't like, they are baked into the current system. So we have to understand what levers exist for us to make changes in the system. We can't just tweak things around the edges. We have to realign the levers that are driving those outcomes, that are reinforcing and reproducing those patterns. So we're going to talk about systems in a way where there's three primary levers, three parts of the system that we are going to focus on. We're going to talk about, first and foremost, the people in the system. So our boundary for any system are the people that are in that system. So again, our tendency is to say things like the education system. Well, education is more of a sector for the purposes of that conversation today. When we talk about a system, we can talk about the education system, for instance, the people who participate in the education system in Washington state. So the first step in defining a system is you want to start with the phrase, the people who. The people who impact, the people who participate, the people who work at, the people who attend, those are all different systems. They're interrelated systems. The people who impact success at a local school district, that's not limited to the people who work at the school district. And if I want to make change in the school district, I need to understand which of those systems am I trying to affect. And the easiest way, the clearest way to make sure that we really zoom in, we're really clear about the boundary, is to start with the phrase, the people who, right? People who. So that's a bit of a tip for you about how you define systems. The first piece is, who are the people? And it turns out the people in a system affect the way the system functions. We do some work with an association of certified public accountants. Those are the people in that association. You can imagine that the people in the CPA association, they have a different set of tendencies than if we were talking about the people in an artists association. The patterns, the practices, the values, the default, the sort of the collective expectations and collective values that are at play tend to be different because those people are different. Their default values tend to be different. Their common experiences tend to be different. So the understanding of the people in the system, first of all, helps us understand the boundary of the system. And second of all, it gives us some insights into the patterns and practices that may be at play within that system. Second, we're going to talk about the relationships among the people in the system. So this is one of the things that makes the difference between a random group of people and a system, is that people in a system have some set of relationships. We could get super technical about this. There are weak ties and strong ties, but at the end of the day, within the context of any system, we know that the system exists because there are relationships among the people in the system. Sometimes those relationships are hierarchical. There's an authority at play. Sometimes those relationships are influence relationships. When people say things like follow the money, that is a relationship of people within a system. Or if we talk about what are the political relationships, political allyship, that's a type of relationship within a system. So as we think about the people in a system, it turns out that the relationships among those people has a huge impact on how the system functions. So understanding the relationships among the people is a big part of being able to understand how systems function. And realigning the relationships among the people in the system is one of the levers that we have at our disposal to change the way a system functions. As we think about the decision-making table, wherever decisions get made, one of the things that tends to happen is that people, by definition, if they're underrepresented, they tend to not be around that table. Their relationship is such that they're not in personal relationship with one another. People at the decision-making table aren't hearing from people that are having lived experiences. The relationship is not as strong as maybe we would want it to be in order to make system change occur. So we can't change a system by just changing the individuals and leaving the existing relationships at play. We have to also think about what are the relationships that need to be in place in order to make the kind of change in the system that we want to make happen. Last but not least, there are the rules and structures in a system. It turns out that the rules and structures in the system, that's a third piece, and you can't get the system to change. It's really hard to change the relationships. It's hard to get people to do things differently if the rules that they have to follow, if the incentives in the system are all aligned around an existing status quo. If we think about the system of people driving down I-5, right? The individual people have all the free will in the world. However, the structure and the rules have a lot to do with what they can and what they will and won't do. It doesn't mean that people don't have free will. It means that if I have to be at work at 9 o'clock in the morning, I'm probably going to get on I-5 sometime around, depending on where I live, 8 o'clock or 8:30. Like, I have free will. I could get on the freeway 2 hours before. I could go into work late. But because from a structural standpoint, so many people are on I-5 arriving at work at about 9 a.m., we all have free will, and yet we're all on the freeway together. We're creating traffic. Like, we're not stuck in traffic. We are the traffic. Traffic's not happening to us. We're making individual choices that result in emergent behavior across the entire system. Because the rules are people arrive at work at about the same time. There's a limited number of lanes of traffic that are available, right? There's a certain amount of incentives for people to carpool, but those incentives aren't high enough to get more people to carpool. Like, those are the rules, right? So those rules, the relationships among the people, and then the individual people at play, like those three things, those are the levers that are available in most systems to make systems change occur. The people, the relationships, and the rules. So mapping helps us understand what's happening within the context of the system. System mapping is a practice of understanding what's happening relative to system dynamics. And so part of what we're going to do when we move to our example here shortly is we're going to have an opportunity to use an example of mapping a system. And here's what we're going to be able to identify as we map a system. First, we're going to think about the inner circle or inner circles, meaning the places in the system where the authority or influence exists in order to set and maintain or enforce rules in the system. So we're gonna define that as our inner circle or inner circles in our system, where the authority and or influence exists to reinforce, to set and or reinforce the rules or structures in the system. Then the outer circles would be the places where there are limited or marginalized ability to set and or reinforce and maintain the rules in the system. Some groups of people overlap those two things. So if I think about if I think about teachers union, there are some members of the union, the leadership of the union, they're sitting around the decision-making tables frequently, not always. They may not perceive themselves as the inner circle, but they certainly are closer to the inner circle than a first-year teacher who just joined the union. Those two people are still a part of the same system, people who are members of the union. However, some people in that group, in that system, are much closer to the inner circle than other people in that system. Some groups of people within our system may exist almost entirely within the inner circle. So if we think about the office of the superintendent of public instruction, like that system, people who work within that system is essentially a part of the inner circle. Now, again, a first-year person who just got hired on there may have less power and influence that than someone else who's been on, unless it's, of course, the person who's just elected to the position of superintendent. But like individual people in that system may have different amounts of power, but ultimately OSPI exists roughly in the inner circle. Okay, all right. We also want to be thinking about implementers. So it turns out that when rules change or rules are in place, the people who have to implement those rules have a really significant impact on whether or not the status quo continues or if change occurs. So mapping helps us make sure we don't overlook implementers, because sometimes we only think about people in positions of authority and or maybe people who are in the margins of a system, in the outer circles. We also have to think about the people who implement existing rules and changing rules. And again, we absolutely have to think about all the people that are affected by what's happening within the system. It's easy to overlook people that are being affected when we think about systems change, which is a sad thing, but it's true. So we have to think sort of beyond the school walls. We have to think about who are the dissenters, people who are trying really hard to make things happen and aren't necessarily being involved. Who are the influencers? When our kids were in public schools, some of the most powerful things that happened within the context of the school our children were at were because of members of the PTA or people who weren't even members of the PTA that had huge influence over things that were happening within the context of our school. So mapping helps us make sure we're paying attention to relationships that may not be obvious by thinking about who are the influencers. Okay. So that's an overview of systems. I know we covered a lot in a short period of time. We talked about why systems are important. We talked about what systems are. We talked about why system mapping is an important thing to do. And so we're going to pause before we move to our example. So now we get an opportunity to give an example around system mapping. And what we're going to do is use our piece of paper here that is designed to look like the system mapping tool that we developed. And one of the things you're going to notice is that at the top of that document, it has people who, because the first step in defining any system is to answer this question. What is the system that we're trying to work with? And for the purpose of this example, we're answering this with people who impact student well-being in Washington State. So impact student well-being in Washington State. Now, instantly, we can start thinking about the different people and groups who impact student well-being in Washington State. So for our example, in a moment, I'm going to start asking you to give me some names of people and groups that impact student well-being in Washington State. And we want to think about this, though, through a particular lens. So we're going to map the overall system. However, we want to pay attention to the what is the change that we're looking to have happen? Well, the change for our example is we want to increase inclusion of students with disabilities. Increase inclusion, students with disabilities. Disabilities. All right. I'll try to draw it right even more clearly. So, as we think about increasing inclusion of students with disabilities, now as we think about people who impact student well-being in Washington State, the question as we think about inner circle and in the margins, the outer circle, is who has the power, who has influence and authority in order to maintain the current amount of inclusion of students with disabilities within Washington State, or would have the ability to increase inclusion of students with disabilities in Washington State. So this gives us a lens through which to be able to understand where the power and influence lies relative to the change we're trying to make happen. And so if I come up with a group of people that don't have influence and authority, I'm going to place them in the outer circle or outer circles of our map. If I think of a group of people or a person that has power and authority for increasing inclusion among students with disabilities, I'm going to place them in the inner circle. And if I talk about a group, I used an example earlier where some of the people may be in the inner circle and some of the people may be in the outer circle of that group. I'm just going to write it directly on my inner circle, outer circle delineation here. Now, in order to keep this clean, rather than write circles around all of these, I'm just going to write names. And please know that, like, we can come back and look at any of them. If they're groups, we can actually unpack them more and look at them as systems as well. Right. So here's what I want to do is I would love to have a couple of people give me some examples who are people who impact student well-being in Washington State. And we can start inner circle, outer circle, wherever you want to be. So please, okay, the local school district, right? And you're saying that's inner circle. So local school district, I'm just going to write it here, local SD. Okay. How about some other ones?
State Board of Education.
And would that be probably in the inner circle?
Yes.
So the state board.
And OSPI. Your local school district.
Right. How about some folks who may not have necessarily authority and power to set the rules and reinforce the rules, but definitely are affected by what happens? Tariq, were you going to say something?
I was going to say students and teachers.
Right. So we can put students.
Community.
I'm going to put teachers here, just because some teachers have more influence and authority than others. What was everything you said, Tariq?
Like the local community around it.
Okay, local community. And where would that fit?
Probably with teachers.
Right.
No.
So here's probably a pretty good rule. If when you say, are they the inner circle or they're the outer circle, and we pause, or I'm not sure, they probably are straddling, right? So local community. Yep. Emily?
Yeah, I was going to say parents and families, and I think they also probably straddle the line.
Parents and families. All right. Well, we're going to use this as an opportunity. Any group of people that we're talking about within the context of this system are likely subsystems of the overall system. So if I think about parents and families, I can actually map that system. So maybe I'm on a local diversity, equity, and inclusion team, or some sort of team that's trying to get things figured out. And they go, oh, we want to make sure we include parents and families. So we could say people who are parents and families in the school district. Okay, so now we're specifically talking about parents and families. Now, when I think about parents and families, I can say, okay, what are some parents and families that are in the margins of the system, the outer circles, and what are parents and families that are in the inner circles of the system? Again, when our kids were going through the public school system, it was very clear to us that there were some parents and families that were very much here. And the work that Jennifer and I did a long time ago, we called them the golden families. right? There may be a different terminology. There may be some more specificity that you can provide. When we were doing system mapping in our office, in my office, we were like, oh, the reason nothing's changing in this particular system is because there's a set of families where the current system is working for them, and they happen to be the people that have the influence and the authority in order to set and maintain the rules. So a lot of work was being done with families and students that were in the margins, trying to bring those people together to have conversations. And these people were not being involved at all. And the result of which was people, relationships, and rules. The relationships between the golden families and the other families weren't changing. The rules and structures that reinforce the ability for golden families to have that power and authority wasn't changing, which meant that ultimately nothing in the system was changing. A lot of activity was happening, a lot of work was occurring, but change wasn't happening. So one of the things that system mapping does for us is it helps us understand who has to be at the table to make change happen. And we have to acknowledge that people that currently have power and authority, like that's where the decisions are happening. So as much as sometimes we think we want to only work with people who are in the margins, part of the work is to make sure we're creating the kind of decision-making spaces where people who have power and authority are now in new relationships structurally where possible with people who didn't have power and authority. And we're now working together in order to identify what are some changes we can work together on. If the people in the inner circles don't understand what the changes are that need to happen, one of the steps then is what are the levels of education and growth that need to occur in order for them to understand why it's important to work with people in the outer circles and margins in order to identify what needs to happen next. So sometimes the system mapping doesn't lead us directly to creating a new decision-making table. Sometimes system mapping helps us understand who are the people that need to understand that it's now time to open up space at a decision-making table. Because they currently have the power and they have the influence and the authority. And they're not inviting people who are in the outer circles to the table, even though those are the people who are being affected by the decisions being made by folks in the inner circles. So the ability to sort of zoom in on some of the subsystems sometimes gives us additional insight into steps that we can take in order to make change happen. Okay. So given our time, I'm going to pause and say this is a sort of a first step to think about what it looks like to do system mapping. You can imagine you can go through and write a lot more names, either overlapping the inner circle and outer circle, or in the outer circles, people that are marginalized, whose power is marginalized, and or people in the inner circle, and think about if we're going to make change happen, who are the people we need to bring together and how do we bring them together in order to ensure that we can make change occur. So what are some other examples of people who impact student well-being in Washington State?
Community-based organizations.
Great, and I'm going to put community-based organizations here because some CBOs are probably more involved in the inner circle than some other community-based organizations. That may be one example. How about some other ones?
School administrators.
School administrators. What do you think? In the inner circle, probably, right? Or close to the inner circles?
Yeah.
Okay. What other examples do we want to use? Or what other groups, people in groups, do we want to add to our example?
Businesses.
Businesses, absolutely. There are for sure some business entities that are really involved and invested in what's happening in education here in Washington State. And then there are clearly some for whom that is not a priority. So again, I would probably put that. And if we wanted to, we could then do an entire system map on businesses that impact student well-being in Washington State, and think about where the what's happening in the context of that system. Who are the groups? Who are the people? What are the relationships? What are the rules and structures that are reinforcing those things? Yeah.
How about school boards, school board members?
Right. So I'm going to put school boards here. I'm actually going to put school board members. Board members in the overlap, because individual school board members don't necessarily have a lot of influence. Some may, some don't. And the board itself, though, has a lot of power, that collective group. And so that's one of the differences, right, between thinking about the groups and thinking about individuals. Individuals have whatever individual power that they may have, whether that's an influence or authority. And then collectives, groups like school boards, actually have a ton of power, even though the individual board members may not necessarily carry that much individual authority. Yeah, what else?
So in addition to teachers, I'm thinking about like principals, nurses, school counselors.
So I'm going to, maybe your experience is different than mine. I'm going to put counselors probably outside of the inner circles, para-educators probably outside of the inner circles in most places. Nurses are probably also outside of the inner circle in most, certainly in my experience. Again, if your personal experience is different and you'd want to put it someplace else, that's great. And again, as we're thinking about this system mapping, who do we want to have at the table in order to make change happen? Counselors, paraeducators, nurses certainly could all help contribute to thinking differently about what's going on with inclusion. And and some of those folks are absolutely underrepresented around in the places where those decisions tend to happen.
How about city governments?
How about city governments? Where would you put them? When it comes to impacting student well-being in Washington State?
I think they're probably in the outer circle.
Okay. I mean, they clearly don't have a direct relationship in Washington State to the school district. However, what happens in our communities absolutely affects student well-being in Washington State. There's no question about it. There are clearly some efforts to bring city leadership to the table in order to help think about ways in which the city affects and the community affects student well-being in the state. And so, yeah, that tells us that can certainly change the relationship and potentially even change the structure and the rules at play that have an effect on our students.
I was also thinking about like agencies like DSHS or DDR or DDA, and they're also in the outer.
So you can see how taking the time to think about who's impacting student well-being and what is their relationship to increasing inclusion among students with disabilities. Like, this is a model that can help us think differently, trigger some additional thoughts. And again, from time to time, where we want to get a better understanding, we can always take one of the groups and look at them as a system in and of itself and understand the ways in which there are people who are more engaged and involved in the decision-making process, where the rules are set and reinforced, and the people who may not be and are ultimately affected by those things, but don't necessarily have a traditional role to play in helping to set and reinforce those things. And certainly, as we look to increase inclusion of students with disabilities, one of the things we'll need to do is have new people, additional people at the table with a different relationship and different ability to help identify what the rules are and help identify the structures that should be in place and reinforce those things and enforce those things in a way that's healthy. The idea about emergence is that, and this is really important for social systems because social systems are defined in the literature as complex systems. And so complex systems, part of what defines a complex system is that they have properties of emergence. And emergence simply is a way of describing the fact that when you put a bunch of things together, you may not know intentionally what those things are going to do, but when they happen, there's a pattern that develops. So most traffic jams are a result of emergence on the streets. And we can affect what happens by changing how many people are on the road, who's on the road at what time, what the relationship is among those people. Like we can change those things, but we have to recognize that it wasn't necessarily the intention of the people who set it up to create that outcome. It emerged because of the complexity and the expectations and the patterns of the people in the system. And so again, individual people have free will. Emergence is a function, it's a result of collective activity. I would encourage us to look at both what it says on paper, like who authority is, who's supposed to have authority, and then also look at the practical application, who ultimately seems to be making decisions. And so one of the ways to identify that is if you see the group that is ostensibly supposed to have the authority or the power to make changes, if they seem like they start making changes and those changes sort of pause or frequently either don't get implemented or they get implemented and overturned, then I would ask myself, what else is happening in the system? What's happening with the structures and rules, or what's happening with the relationships in the system where the people who are supposed to have the authority, the power to make change happen, aren't able to do that? Someone someplace is exercising what sometimes is described as a pocket veto. They're not coming to the table, they're just making sure that no change is occurring. They're not coming to the table, and then when change wants to happen, they're ensuring that it's not occurring. They're maintaining the status quo because they have the ability to do so.
Our thanks to James and Kristen Whitfield at Be Culture for partnering with us on this video module and for sharing their expertise related to systems thinking and systems mapping for this training. When we consider the three parts of the system that James discussed, let's think about how systems mapping in the context of the community conversation is a critical step. We know that systems are made up of people, and the people in a system affect how that system functions. If we want to move a system toward equity and inclusion, it is critical for us to understand the people who exist within the system in which we are trying to affect change. Relationships within a system are an additional critical element to understand. As James discussed in the video, we cannot change a system by just changing the individuals and leaving behind the existing relationships within that system. Building an understanding of those relationships and being clear on relationships that need to be in place in order to make the kinds of change that we want to see in our schools and districts is why we look to systems mapping within the toolkit to broaden our perspective on the systems at play. The third aspect of a system that was discussed is the rules and structures. We have to examine what structures align around the existing status quo and what would have to change in those structures to move the system away from that status quo and toward equity. Let's think about how this connects directly to the Inclusionary Practices Community Conversation Toolkit. In the community conversation, we invite people to listen deeply, ask questions, be curious, and learn from one another. Learning from one another challenges us to consider perspectives other than our own and seek to be open to growing in our ability to empathize and understand more of the complexities of a problem. We utilize the strategy of systems mapping to more fully understand the people, relationships, and structures that exist in the system impacting inclusive education in our community, and to ensure that our conversation is planned with and includes all of the diverse perspectives and experiences of the people in our systems. Doing so will help us to ensure that the people in both the inner and outer circles are included, and that we are moving towards strengthening relationships in the system. It will help us to identify people to invite to the planning team, identify partners in the community and who we need to ensure is invited to the conversation, as well as identifying resources and relationships necessary for meaningful change to take place and to be sustained. We have included multiple systems mapping tools to help planning teams to map the system in which they are working to affect change in their own community. These tools, along with this video training module, are intended to offer support and structure for people to build an understanding of the systems that are supporting the status quo that they want to address, and with their use, bring people together who are impacted by the system to have conversations about inclusive education in their own schools and school districts. Systems understanding and mapping builds our own understanding of our community and of systems impacting our students. It is critical that we seek out a broad shareholder group and create opportunity to embrace different perspectives and approaches, including people with diverse life experiences, backgrounds, and community connections. We will identify strategies and ideas that are more equitable and inclusive. If you're interested in learning more about the work of Be Culture and James and Kristen Whitfield, visit their website and watch the TEDx Seattle talk that James gave in 2021. You can learn more about the toolkit by watching the Introducing the Community Conversation Toolkit webinar, which is posted on the Family Engagement Collaborative website. There, you can stay in touch, find out about upcoming events, publications, and trainings. And you'll also find additional video training modules with deeper dives into other aspects of the toolkit, including gracious space and accessibility. Now, as we close this learning module, I want to encourage you to take time to do a personal reflection. Think about one thing in this presentation that resonated with you, and then reflect on what action you can take based on your learning today. With our deep appreciation for watching and hope that you'll learn more about the Inclusionary Practices Community Conversation Toolkit and about the elements of systems thinking.